England stood on the edge of ruin. Viking warlords swept through its lands, burning, raiding, conquering, and in the shadows of defeat, one king refused to surrender. Hunted, broken, yet unyielding, Alfred rose from the marshes to fight back. This is not the legend told in sagas. This is the true story of Alfred the Great versus the Vikings. Not every legend is glorious. Some are drenched in blood and betrayal. The chronicles of England open with fire. The year is 865, and a darkness spreads across the land. It does not fall from the heavens, nor rise from the earth. It sails on the sea, carried by the dragon-prowed ships of the Vikings. For decades, they had come in swift raids, striking monasteries, plundering villages, and vanishing back into the mist. But this time was different. This time, the storm would not pass. It would stay. The great heathen army, led by men whose names would echo through centuries, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Guthrum, descended on the English kingdoms with one purpose, conquest, and in their path stood a fragile, divided land. England was not yet a single kingdom. It was four: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the heartland, East Anglia in the east, and Wessex in the south. Each had its own king, its own ambitions, its own fears. United, they might have resisted. Divided, they were prey. The storm struck first in Northumbria. The city of York fell, its streets soaked in blood, its walls echoing with screams. Kings were dragged from their thrones, slain or enslaved, their crowns meaningless against the fury of the Northmen. Then East Anglia burned. King Edmund, remembered as Saint Edmund, was tied to a tree and shot with arrows until his body bristled like a hedgehog, a martyr to his people, a warning to all who resisted. Mercia bowed next, forced into uneasy submission. Only one kingdom remained, Wessex, and it was here that fate turned to a young prince named Alfred. Alfred was not born to rule. He was the youngest son of King Ethelwulf, a boy often plagued by illness, more at home with books and prayer than with the sword. He had traveled to Rome in his youth, seen the grandeur of empires past, and returned with a sense of destiny. But never had he imagined that destiny would demand so much. His elder brothers fell one by one, first Ethelbald, then Ethelbert, then Ethelred, until the crown rested on Alfred's head. It was not a crown of gold, but a crown of thorns. For when Alfred became king in 871, the great heathen army had already crushed half of England, and now they turned their eyes on him. Imagine England in those years, a land of wooden halls and stone churches, green fields now blackened by smoke, families huddled in fear as longships glided up the rivers. A bell might toll for prayer one morning, only to be silenced by the clash of steel before noon. The chronicles speak of famine, of children stolen into slavery, of monasteries desecrated, their holy relics scattered in the mud. To many, it seemed the end of the world had come. Alfred inherited not just a kingdom, but a nightmare. And yet, this young king understood something his enemies did not. The Vikings were strong, yes, ferocious in battle, cunning in strategy. But they were not invincible. They could bleed. They could be delayed, harried, exhausted. But Alfred also knew he could not fight them alone. Wessex was but one kingdom, and even within his borders, unity was fragile. His nobles feared the might of the Vikings, some whispering that it was better to submit than to resist. Alfred had to be more than a king. He had to be a shepherd, a unifier, a voice that turned despair into defiance. Still, doubt haunted him. He was no giant of a man, no warrior carved of iron. Illness often left him weak, his body betraying him even as his mind raced with plans. And he carried the heavy burden of faith. To Alfred, this war was not only for land or power, it was for the soul of Christendom in England. If Wessex fell, the cross itself might vanish from these shores, replaced by the hammer of Thor and the old gods of the north. The stage was set for a conflict that would define history. On one side, the Vikings, relentless, their shield walls bristling, their longships crowding the rivers, their ambition nothing less than the domination of an entire land. On the other, Alfred, a king untested, surrounded by enemies, standing at the edge of ruin. And yet, it was from this edge that greatness would rise. The chronicles do not paint him as flawless. They tell of his early defeats, his moments of despair, his struggles against betrayal and hopelessness. But they also tell of his cunning, his endurance, his refusal to yield when all seemed lost. Before he became the Great, Alfred was simply a man trying to keep the fire of his people from being extinguished. And in those darkest days, when the Viking storm threatened to swallow England whole, it was Alfred's resolve that lit the first spark of resistance. The war was only beginning. The land burned. The people prayed. And both sides prepared for the battles that would decide the future of a nation. He was no king, no warrior, yet his choice altered the fate of nations. Alfred's reign began not with triumph, but with blood. The Vikings had already shattered kingdoms greater than his, and when they marched south into Wessex, they came with a force so overwhelming that resistance seemed hopeless. The year 871 was known as the Year of Battles, 9 great clashes between Alfred's men and the invaders. And though Alfred fought bravely, though his shield wall held again and again, the cost was unbearable. His soldiers were exhausted. His treasury bled dry. His people, weary of war, began to despair. Alfred was crowned king that same year, after the death of his brother Ethelred. The crown weighed heavy on his head. He was young, untested, and now the last line of defense for a kingdom trembling before the storm. He had no choice but to negotiate. In exchange for peace, he paid the Vikings tribute, silver taken from a land already starving. It bought him time, but not safety. The Northmen always returned. Years passed in uneasy tension. Some Viking leaders grew bold enough to settle, carving out farms and villages in the lands they had conquered. Others continued to raid, striking without warning. Alfred rebuilt his strength in those fragile years, training men, fortifying towns, watching, waiting. But the storm broke again in 878. Guthrum, the Viking leader, launched a sudden assault in the dead of winter. Alfred was unprepared. His forces scattered. His court dissolved. His family fled. And the King of Wessex was driven into the marshes, hunted, broken, almost forgotten. Imagine it. A king reduced to a fugitive, hiding in the swamps of Somerset. The reeds closed around him, the mist thick and suffocating. His companions were few, his food scarce, his future uncertain. Chroniclers tell of a moment when Alfred, sheltering in a peasant's hut, was asked to watch a woman's loaves as they baked on the fire. Distracted by thoughts of his lost kingdom, he let them burn. The woman scolded him, not knowing she berated her king. It is a simple story, perhaps even a myth, but within it lies a truth. Alfred was a man brought low, humbled, tested in the fire of despair. In those marshes, Alfred might have given up. Many would have. He had lost his crown, his lands, his pride. The Vikings ruled nearly all of England. To rise again seemed impossible. Yet it was here, in the stillness of defeat, that Alfred found his strength. He turned to faith, believing that God had spared him for a reason. He listened to his people, sharing their suffering, their hunger, their fear. Slowly, he began to gather men, outlaws, farmers, warriors who still clung to hope. They came to him not because he was a king, but because he represented defiance, the last spark of a nation refusing to die. Alfred studied the enemy carefully. He understood that the Vikings thrived on speed, surprise, and terror. To defeat them, he needed more than courage. He needed strategy. From the marshes, he launched raids of his own, striking Viking outposts, vanishing back into the wilderness before they could retaliate. For the first time, the invaders felt what it was to be hunted. But Alfred's greatest test was yet to come. In the spring of 878, as the land thawed from winter's grip, Alfred gathered his scattered forces. Men from Wessex answered his call, hardened by loss, desperate for one last chance to reclaim their homes. It was not a great army, not compared to the host that Guthrum commanded, but it was united by something the Vikings could never match, a burning will to survive. The marshes echoed with the sound of iron as Alfred's men sharpened their blades. The king himself moved among them, speaking not as a distant ruler, but as a comrade in arms. He told them that this was not just a battle for land, but for faith, for families, for the very soul of England. If they failed, everything would be lost. If they triumphed, a new dawn might break. This was the moment Alfred had been forged for. No longer the uncertain young king, No longer the fugitive hiding in the swamps, he emerged as a leader transformed by suffering. His spies tracked Guthrum's movements, learning where the Viking army had encamped at a place called Edington. And there, Alfred would make his stand. The morning of battle was heavy with silence. Mists curled over the fields, the air tense, every man knowing that what happened here would echo for generations. Alfred's men formed their shield wall, shields locked tight, spears bristling. Across the field, the Vikings roared, their war cries shattering the stillness. Steel rang against steel as the two walls crashed together, the ground shaking with the fury of combat. This was no quick skirmish. It was a brutal, grinding clash, each side pressing, straining, breaking, reforming. Men fell in heaps, their cries mingling with the clash of iron. The shield walls bent, but Alfred's line did not break. His men, hardened by years of despair, fought with a desperation the Vikings could not match. And then, slowly, the tide turned. Alfred's wall surged forward, driving the Northmen back step by bloody step. The Viking line fractured. Their warriors scattered. Guthrum himself was forced to retreat, fleeing to a fortified stronghold. But Alfred did not relent. He besieged the fortress until the Vikings, starved and broken, surrendered. It was a victory not just of arms, but of will. What followed was remarkable. Alfred did not execute Guthrum. Instead, he demanded baptism. The Viking warlord, once a terror of Christendom, was christened with Alfred as his godfather, taking the name Athelstan. It was not merely mercy, it was strategy. By converting his enemy, Alfred struck a symbolic blow that echoed far beyond the battlefield. The man who had once crouched in the marshes, hiding from the world, had now risen to shape it. His kingdom was scarred, but it still stood. And for the first time in years, the people of Wessex could believe in something other than fear. Yet the war was far from over. The Vikings still held vast swathes of England. The Danelaw, territories under Norse control, stretched across the land. The struggle between Alfred and the Northmen would continue, shifting from battlefield to strategy, from raids to treaties. But in that spring of 878, at Edington, Alfred proved something vital, that the Vikings could be stopped. And from that moment on, the fate of England began to change. The past does not sleep. It shapes the present in ways we often forget. The smoke of Edington had hardly cleared when Alfred looked out upon his kingdom. He had won a battle, yes, but a single battle does not end war. The Vikings still held vast lands across England. Their settlements stretched across the north and east, forming what history would call the Danelaw. To the people of Wessex, victory at Edington felt like a miracle, but Alfred knew it was only a beginning. His task was not merely to defend Wessex. It was to ensure that his people could survive in a world where danger lurked on every horizon. And so Alfred began to shape a kingdom unlike any that had come before. The first step was defense. The Vikings were masters of sudden strikes, their longships slipping up rivers and creeks, unleashing terror, then vanishing before resistance could gather. Alfred resolved to deny them that advantage. Across Wessex, he built a network of fortified towns, called Buzz. These were not grand castles of stone, but strongholds of earth and timber, strategically placed, so that no settlement was ever far from safety. Roads were laid between them, ensuring that men could march quickly in times of danger. It was a system born not of glory but of necessity, and it worked. Raids that once spread like wildfire were now contained, blunted by walls, by garrisons, by people who no longer fled but stood their ground. Yet Alfred knew that walls alone could not hold back the sea. The Vikings were masters of water, their longships unmatched in speed and maneuverability. To meet them, Alfred built ships of his own, larger, sturdier, designed to withstand both storm and battle. They were clumsy at first, experimental, but they marked the birth of something new, the beginnings of the English Navy. Still, Alfred's genius was not only in war. He saw that the true strength of a kingdom lay not just in swords, but in minds. England, battered by years of conflict, had grown ignorant. Learning had withered, schools had closed, Latin texts were neglected, and with them the wisdom of centuries. Alfred, who had always cherished knowledge, refused to let this decay continue. He gathered scholars from distant lands, men of learning from Mercia, from Wales, from beyond the sea, and set them to work in Wessex. Together, they began to translate important works into the English tongue, so that knowledge would not remain locked away in Latin, accessible only to priests. He himself took part in the labor, not merely as a patron but as a translator, pen in hand, king and student alike. It was in these years that the foundations of the English language, as we know it, began to take shape. Alfred's vision was clear: a kingdom united not just by walls and weapons, but by culture, faith, and learning. But for all his wisdom, Alfred was never free from the shadow of the Vikings. Treaties were made, borders drawn, truces declared, but always with the knowledge that peace could shatter at any moment. The Danelaw remained, a vast swath of England under Norse control, its people living by laws and customs foreign to Wessex. And yet, Alfred understood something profound. If he could not destroy the Danelaw, he could contain it. If he could hold Wessex strong, then one day, perhaps, his descendants might reclaim what was lost. The image of Alfred in his later years is not of a conquering king, surrounded by riches, but of a weary man who bore the weight of survival itself. He knew hunger, sickness, betrayal, and despair. He knew the bitterness of defeat and the sweetness of hard-earned victory. And yet through it all, he endured. The chronicles remember him as England's shepherd, not because he was gentle, but because he guided his people through storms that would have destroyed lesser rulers. He built, he taught, he defended, not for glory, but because there was no one else to do it. When Alfred died in 899, he left behind a kingdom scarred by war but unbroken. Wessex stood firm, a beacon in a land still divided. His children and grandchildren would carry forward his work, pushing back the boundaries of the Danelaw, laying the foundations for what would one day become a united England. Without Alfred, there may never have been an England at all. Think of this: a fugitive king hiding in the marshes, reduced to ashes and despair, who rose to forge the backbone of a nation. Without him, the Vikings might have swept across all the isles, reshaping history in their image. Without him, the English language might never have survived. Without him, the story of England as we know it might never have begun. And so he is remembered not simply as Alfred, but as Alfred the Great, the only English king to bear that title. Not for wealth, not for conquest, but for endurance, wisdom, and vision. But greatness is never simple. Alfred's victories came at terrible cost. His people suffered famine, his soldiers bled, his land was scarred by fire. Even his peace with Guthrum was fragile, upheld more by necessity than by trust. History often polishes such figures into legends, but behind the legend was a man frail, sickly at times, fearful, uncertain. That he endured despite all this is what makes him truly great, and perhaps that is why his story still matters. For in every age, in every struggle, the lesson remains the same, that even when hope seems lost, when kingdoms fall and darkness closes in, the spark of resilience can light a fire strong enough to outlast the storm. The Vikings came as a terror, and they left their mark on England forever. Their blood, their culture, their spirit became woven into the land they once sought to conquer. But Alfred ensured that it was not their world alone that endured. His vision carried forward, shaping not only a kingdom but the very idea of England. The past does not sleep. It lingers in the language we speak, in the walls that still stand, in the stories we tell. And Alfred's choice, to rise when all was lost, to fight when surrender seemed easier, echoes still. So the next time you hear of Vikings and kings, of battles fought long ago, remember the man who hid in the marshes, who burned the loaves, who stood at Edington, and who built a nation from the ashes of despair. He was no king, no warrior, at least, not at first. He was something rarer. He was a shepherd who refused to abandon his flock. And that choice changed the fate of nations.